Welcome to today's edition of Daytime Dialogues. I have the great privilege to welcome today Rabbi Dr. Jeffrey Woolf. Rabbi Dr. Woolf is really one of the leading academic voices in the world today when it comes to the question not only of the history of halakha and medieval and Renaissance Jewish history, Italian Jewish history, the interaction of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, but also when it comes to the interface of culture and Judaism, what we'll refer to as modern orthodoxy for lack of a better title. And he's also outspoken in many of those realms where he sees things are changing and shifting and where sometimes it seems a little bit not as honest as it can be. So it's my pleasure to welcome Rabbi Woolf. Thank you so much for joining us. And
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor.
And it's great to have you. And I understand it's snowing in Yerushalayim, in Efrat right now.
Not the afternoon anymore, but yeah, it's snowing, and the entire country is having a festival. In fact, I live in Efrat. The hostel that is attached to Kfar Tzion actually is booked up by people from the coastline who want to come and see what snow looks like.
Wow! and having been in Israel when it snows, they aren't as good at dealing with it as Chicagoans.
We have 3 snow plows. I mean, what many do you need?
That's it. So let me, I'm going to just start going back a little bit in your history, if it's all right. You're a Talmud both of Rav Soloveitchik. You were more than 9.5 years at Yeshiva University learning with Rav Soloveitchik, and you were also a Talmud of his son-in-law, Professor Twersky, at Harvard, where you received both your master's and your PhD.
Correct.
What was it like learning with the Rav? And then what was it like? And was Rav Twersky also as fierce as sometimes we hear him as a professor?
Well, first of all, a small correction. I'm a Bostonian, so that I actually learned for the first 5 years, I actually studied with the Rav in Boston. And then I ended up in the middle of my doctorate taking what I thought was going to be a 1-year leave of absence, became 4 years to go to New York. So my first, the ties between the Rav and myself were from Boston, which made life a lot easier because the Rav always first of all, was his home turf. And second of all, he was, I don't want to say he indulged us, but Boston boys always had a sort of a certain advantage in terms of that. And I also had the privilege of being his driver for a period of time. So that also meant that there wasn't doesn't mean I didn't revere him to the point of being scared, but it was a different type of thing.
I've heard that the Rav, the personality of the Rav in Boston was very different than his personality when he was in New York.
Very relaxed, very accessible. I have all kinds of stories about driving him. The first time I actually drove him, he was living already at Professor and Mrs. Twersky's. His wife had died a number of years before, and I was driving, and they lived on top of this hill. And I was afraid to give any gas to the engine because I have the Rav in the car, and the car kept stalling. So the Rav looked at me and said, very quietly, not whatever. He says, I really think you should check the carburetor. And he started giving me a whole lecture about carburetors. So that was like not. So there was that. It was that kind. There was very much an ease to it. It was not having sat with him and talked both in Boston and in New York. He was much more stressed out, much more tense in New York. Boston, he was at home, and it made for a different relationship and made for a different kind of interaction. Professor Twersky, on the other, and also he had the Rav before his wife died. I understand from people who were there, was much fiercer, and he mellowed with age and excuse me, and perhaps as a result of the tragedies that he went through in the years 1967. So while we were afraid, we were reverent, and so on. It was a different kind of relationship. Professor Twersky, on the other hand, was terrifying. He never really spoke to us. We would ask him a question, you get absolute silence. When I encounter him, I would often think of Potak's book, The Chosen, where the first book actually is talking about how the Hasidic Rebbe's son was raised in silence, and
Right.
the terror that encountered. Oh, actually, it's based on the Kutzker, and the Kutzker's Yartzeit actually was earlier this week. And that it was very, we were really very. It was a very.
Did he have also two sides when he was in his shtibel versus when he was in the university?
And I, not so much that as it was there his students and there's everybody else. The people that he with whom he interacted that were not his students, he was fine with. I mean, he was, you know, and the same thing in terms of people in the shul. But when it came to his students, he was incredibly reserved. Didn't mean he wasn't generous, but his idea was, I guess, that you're supposed to do it on your own until, you know, maybe if you fall down, maybe he'll pick you up. But it was very much, you know, force yourself to the absolute max. It's a different type of mentoring than we're used to today. Certainly where you today in the academic culture is you indulge the student and the student is the consumer. That was not the case there. And, you know, and you turned in your papers and you sweated.
Right. It has changed. The expectations of students.
Right. I mean, I don't go that far, but I did often find myself saying, what would Professor Twersky do? And then go do the opposite.
And then fast forwarding to today. Now, you teach at Bar Ilan University, but also you lecture all over the world, especially now in the days of Zoom. Right. Today you're in Chicago. I can't even imagine where you'll be tomorrow, thanks to Zoom.
Listen, I mean, in Chicago, I don't know if Avita is still open, but yes, I mean, okay, so that and now I can't remember the KINS Diner and you two, we went to a Chinese restaurant. One of the best Chinese restaurants I've ever.
Well, that unfortunately closed, but that's okay.
My entire life I have lived on something of on a spectrum between rabbi and doctor, and I've never devoted myself 100% to one of them, and because I can't. It's just not. I am existentially not built for that, and as a result, throughout my life, I've always been involved in not just in academic work, but also in Tzarchei Tzibur, and trying to teach Torah in the best way I can.
And you've done that with the Orthodox Forum, which you were a key player in, and so many other things. It's interesting now because you have a presence on social media, and I've been reading and I've been watching, and as I mentioned to you right before we started this program, I've been enjoying your Divrei Torah online as well, and I recognize your background of your study from where you're normally teaching. But what I find really very interesting today is some of the conversations that are taking place within social media and your comments about some of the positions that are happening. There's the legislation that's being put forth by Matanky, the Saradat, the Minister of Religion in Israel, about reforms in conversion and reforms also in kashrut, and some of the moves, the shifts, I don't know if it's to the right, to the left, or every which way you can imagine, and your positions on it. When you look at the world today, especially at our religious world today, are we in a good place? Are we in a healthy place?
Oh, that's a very hard question to answer. I'll start by noting that despite the fact that of late I've been associated with supporting Minister Kahana's, I don't like the use of the word. I don't like the use of the word reform.
Changes.
It's actually more loaded here in Israel than it is in America. Partly because they don't know what reform means, but the irony is that I don't think we're in a good place, but not because of over too much stricture. I am and have been for many, many years deeply, deeply concerned at the corrosive impact of whatever you want to call it, postmodern, late modern, progressive, whatever you want. There are winds blowing that are blowing through the internet into the minds and hearts of believing Jews. It's especially effective in terms of, especially deleterious in terms of students or people, even people under 30. And the fact that we are not pushing back. A lot of the demands that are being made of the Torah in the last, let's say, 15, 20 years, some of them are, I mean, all of them are, I'm sure people are genuine, but many, some of them are predicated on ideas that that are an anathema to Torah Judaism, even if you're the most liberal person. And
Can you give an example? Can you give an example?
I think that a lot of our attitude towards halachic change is predicated upon a point of departure, which is often not it can't be alighted well with Torah. A lot of positions that are being advocated on questions of gender, excuse me, where it's just, there's a collision course between the two definition of family, things of that sort. There's a limit to what, to how much give the Torah has, and if you are a believing Jew, then the Torah's bottom line is your bottom line. And as Rav Soloveitchik used to say, at that point, you're Makabel Ol Malchut Shamayim, you accept the yoke of heaven. Or historically, the way that Judaism has interacted with the outside world is a matter of sort of a meeting of equals, in the sense that we have our integrated worldview. The outside world challenges us. Then we take a look inside and see, well, what's authentic, what's not authentic, where can we do? Is it worth it? Do we have a pre-existent need to adjust, and you work accordingly? What the outside world is demanding is, if you don't fully surrender, then you have no right to exist, and that's very dangerous, especially because we have not created, neither in Israel or in America, we have not created thinkers of substance who are able to critically engage postmodern thought and postmodern ideas and postmodern values, to call them out for what they are, because often in public discourse, especially in the media, they're not enunciated, they're just assumed, and criticizing them, looking at them critically rather, and saying, well, what does this really mean, and what are the implications of these ideas, and what can we accept and what not, and also to take there's an expression we have in the army here that the best way of fighting is to move the fight over into the enemy territory. That gives you space, right? And territorial strategic depth, as they say. And to say, look at what you're doing, what you're saying is absolutely indefensible logically, or whatever the case might be. We don't have anybody doing that. The Rav did it. To a significant degree. He had students who did it. Rabbi Berkowitz, to a certain degree, did it, but none of the students had students, or they weren't supported in that regard.
Why would you say that? Why is it that we don't have that generation of thinkers like the Rav? There was a theory many years ago by the protagonist of Rav Moshe. There was a Rabbi Schwartz who said that part of it is because we've democratized education as opposed to being an elitist education. And so the base medrash may be filled, but they're filled with average and not filled with excellent. And so we haven't allowed.
All right. So, but you want everybody to learn Torah. That's not,
Yeah.
I mean,
So why haven't we developed the people who can be that next generation of thinkers who can engage and challenge?
Lack of foresight, and too much navel gazing, and too much self-congratulation. It's interesting. I just remembered this story about in one of the last times that I went to see the Rav. When he started to fail, I was in Israel in 83, 84, and I came back. He was obviously still failing. He was obviously failing. I didn't see him that often after that because I felt it was. I was doing an indignity by visiting when he was not at his best. But one of the last times I went to see him, we were talking about this, and he said one of the biggest problems facing Orthodoxy since '85 is triumphalism. They were self-satisfied, and because we're self-satisfied, we're going to go soft. He didn't put it exactly that way. And he said, and we have to realize that we're not even a real movement yet, which is an interesting, when I think about it in retrospect, movements have ideologies. At least they have common visions. We have a common vision in terms of learning, and in terms of lumdus, and in terms of halacha. But if you don't balance halacha by strengthening the substratum of belief and ideas that support it, then you're going to end up with an anomaly like what was it called? Social orthodoxy, which was was a big run about that a few years ago, as a result of an article and commentary. And if there's not a profound belief in God and willingness to submit to God, then we're going to be in very serious trouble as a result. And I fear, at least in the modern Orthodox community, there's far too much self-satisfaction, far too much sophistication, pseudo-sophistication, and not enough active engagement with God as a commanding force in our life, not just as somebody who's someone we can exploit to make ourselves feel spiritual.
Were you surprised that Pew came out with their most recent study, and they spoke about, in the study, there were about a third of those who were raised Orthodox who are no longer Orthodox, that we're losing such a high percentage? Are you surprised by such a statistic?
I didn't see the breakdown in terms of, we're talking about former Haredim or former modern Orthodox.
They didn't break down kinds
That's
of
the problem.
Right.
It's funny. I'm not surprised. Look, there's always going to be a certain amount of recidivism, and there's always going to be a certain number of people we're going to lose, and we have a certain number of people we're going to gain. That happens. My impression from interaction, and I've been in Israel for almost 30 years, so I'm not that much of you don't get a really healthy picture from media or from just anecdotes. Right. But my impression is that our community is far more assimilated than we give ourselves credit for, or we don't take that seriously. Because at the end of the day, assimilation is a matter of identifying with another identity. And when you have two identities that are and you don't make a choice between the two, then that can have very deleterious it can undermine one's primarily Jewish ideas. Also, we idolize people who are historicists. Far too many. It's not true of the earlier generation, my teacher's generation. Even though I studied with Professor Twersky it took me 15 years. That's another story. After 13 years, he asked me what's my hurry is.
Well, so you probably didn't write your check.
I should have told him. I should have told him at the time what a friend of mine told him was, my mother actually was sick with cancer at the time. She wanted to the generation after Professor Twersky, people like David Berger and Schneier Lyman and people like that are not guilty of this. But the generation afterwards is overly historicist. They said that sort of we judge the Torah and assume that because somehow academic knowledge of Torah is better or truer than a traditional approach, which is really not true. If anything, I've discovered how little I know for fact. I study a later period. Never mind, people get involved in Bible and Talmud. I think that the way that I've encountered more and more orthopraxis in our community, and I think that's very dangerous, because that's 1 foot in, 1 foot out. And I think so as a result, that there should be 30% recidivism. I'm not surprised. So if the Rav, in one of his Chamesh Drashot, one of those famous lectures he gave at the Mizrahi convention, talked about Joseph and his brothers, Yosef and Chav, and he was explaining how he left what was the Brisker tradition to join with religious Zionists.
And we view that as also obviously joining within the what we'll call the modern Orthodox world. Do you think today there still is room for viewing the modern Orthodox world as the way to save the Jewish people, just like Joseph saved the Jews?
It's a wonderful question. It's something that I agonize over a lot. And I'm writing a book, I'm writing one book about a 15th century posek named Mari Kolon, but I'm also writing a book about Jewish thought. I will tell you, it's a mix. If the outside world can enhance us, the outside world has what to give us in terms of enhancing our own world and making us feel and enhancing our understanding of Torah in the wider sense. In that regard, yes, I think it does. On the other hand, I think especially in present circumstances, I think that we have to be extremely, I think we have to be really extremely cautious, and I think we have to be much more critical. And I would not have said, as I wrote, one of my first published articles was in La Ela, I think 1989. It was one of the only, it was actually my only direct encounter with late Rabbi Sachs. That's all because he was still the editor at the time. And at that time, I offered that, excuse me, that Mada should be put, the present day Chochma, present day general culture should be put on the same pedestal, given the same status as philosophy in the time of the Rambam, where actually the two were felt to be coterminous, and the fundamental, the prime directive, if you want to use the prime directive of Jewish thinkers should be to resolve all the seeming points of contradiction between the outside world and Torah, and then everybody be fine. I no longer think that. I think that whatever the outside world has to offer has to take a second. It should have an ancillary, subservient place in terms of Torah. It can enhance. It can do two things. First of all, it can enhance our own internal lives. And I believe in broad education. I believe in people learning a lot of languages. I mean, I'm very proud of the fact that I know 6 languages, 7 languages, and it's made me a better person as a result. Music is music. On the other hand, you have to keep things into perspective and see what's as important. Plus, aside from YU, I don't know of a university, based on things I hear from colleagues, I don't know of a university in the United States that I would, without hesitation, tell an Orthodox kid to go to today. Certainly not for a BA. For advanced degrees, perhaps, but not for BA. It's just, the situation is just so out of control that, and I hear this from friends who, I have a friend who's in charge of a women's program in Jerusalem, and she says that she spends the entire year with her kids in Israel, preparing them for progressive and woke ideology and all kinds of things. And after 6 months, she starts getting these letters about how she lives in a lunch foot, this person, how she's a war criminal, and it goes down from there. So
I once asked Rav Lichtenstein, I was doing an interview with him in public. It was, and I asked him about college and graduate school. I said, you went to Harvard, so I would assume that you would be in favor of other students continuing in the same path to study at Harvard and other of the Ivy League schools. He said, on one condition: I went to Harvard with a promise from the Rav that I'd have a chavrusa. If they, with the same conditions, it would be fine.
Right. I mean, and I went through, and when I was at BU, before I did I did 2 BAs, one at Hebrew College and one at BU, but I was also going to the Rav once a week. And I was also learning privately with Rabbi Kellemer from Zecher Tzadik Livracha from West Hempstead. That was 11 to 1 in the morning, but that was a different experience. I want to mention, on the other hand, there is a need for, but on the other hand, as I mentioned before, there is a need to be literate with the outside world in order to be able to identify the world in which you live, because we live in the outside world, and do about it, and be critical of it, and critically engage it, and to be able to talk to everybody else. We have in Israel, for example, we're in this ironic situation where for the last 25 years there has been a miraculous, I don't know what else to call it, a miraculous strengthening and deepening of the connection of the overwhelming majority of the population, the non-Orthodox population, to Torah, to mitzvahs, to tradition. And one of the things which is retarding that, growth, which is, I mean, we are the last study I saw says that among Israelis, 82% believe in Rabbinic Shalom in a traditional sense, which is stunning. Okay, that's what we're dealing with. The problem is there are not that many rabbis or teachers of either sex who can translate Torah concepts in terms that a person without a in-depth Torah education can understand. So that's a tragic situation, because you have an audience, you have a clientele which is desperate for really desperate for knowledge, and you've got a lot of people who are good-hearted and want to be able to teach, but they both speak Hebrew. But as there was a interesting guy by himself, a man named Adam Baruch, his real name was Adam Rosenblum, whose grandfather was Rav Wachtwell, who was the one of the, I think he was the Mashgiach in the Yeshivat Mei Sharim. He himself, I'm not clear what he was, but anyways, he used to say that, yeah, we all speak Hebrew, but part of the population speaks Jewish and part of the population speaks Israeli, and it might as well be two different languages. And we need to be able to speak Israeli to be able to teach Torah to a broader audience. And as a broader
I don't know if you remember Rabbi Emanuel Feldman, his first introduction to the first edition of Tradition that he was the editor for, wrote a classic essay called Tefillin in a Paper Bag. And he challenged the Rabbonim. He said, we need to learn how to present Torah with the same beauty that Torah is, because the way we present it, the language we use today, is analogous to putting our beautiful tefillin into a paper bag.
Correct.
That is, people question me very often about being part of this broader world, and with all the risks. And I said, we're the important bridges. That the way that a more Haredi community can exist within a broader Jewish community is they often need us to be able to communicate, to create relationships.
More than that, the outside world, when the Chassam Sofer in the 19th century, and Reb Shimshon Farley Hirsch, for that matter, in the 19th century, separated from the general community. The point was you can have your own papers and your own sources of information. You can live on your own, and you'll be able to survive. And your relations with the outside world will be relations of business or whatever the case might be, and more than and you can be fine. But okay, so that worked until the internet. Now there is no way to keep the outside world out. So you're going to encounter the outside world either way. So the question, you're going to do it consciously, and you're going to do it with education and with awareness, or passively, and find yourself being, have your entire outlook and sensitivities adjusted or changed accordingly. So the Haredim we both need those tools. Yes, we can teach the Haredim better how to do that, but there's no place that's really safe. And therefore, the only way to, I think, to respond is to engage and to develop, and that, I think, it's the responsibility of all rabbis and educators. I don't care under what circumstances, to have a certain degree of ability to be able to translate concepts and to be able to respond, and to be gutsy enough to say, you know what, that's someplace I can't go. That's something I can't do. That, it's. The Rav used to, in so many different ways, Rav Soloveitchik was prescient. He was way ahead of his time. He used to love the Medrash in Bereishis Rabbah, where the Medrash says, why was Abraham called the Ivri? Because Kol Olam Me'ever Hazeh v'hu Me'ever Lazeh. That Aver means the side, that the whole world's on one side and he's on the other side. Well, that's Jewish existence, and it's only gotten, in that regard, it's only gotten harsher, and I think it's posed a threat to other Jews, not to mention to the outside world, as they've discovered our existence. I don't know what to make. Well, you tell me. I don't know what to make of the fact that the most popular shows on Netflix are all about lapsed Orthodox Jews.
We don't.
The celebration, not just this woman Julia, whatever her name is, but there's been so many others. There's this chagiga of when the book Shulam, this was guy Shulam Dean, All these books come out. Oh, that's wonderful. We're gonna, we're gonna be. So there's got this response has got to come from somewhere.
And believe it or not, our time is up. And on that note, I don't want to stop, but I do want to thank you.
Thank you very much
for this conversation, not just for the conversation, but for all of the thought you've put into this over the years and the positions you've taken. And I have a feeling, if it's all right, I'm probably going to call on you again to continue this conversation on this idea of how do we teach and what do we teach? And those are the challenges we have. But I do think the one point that I want to stress over again is we have a place. We just have to make sure that we don't dilute the place in which we're in. We keep that place with commitment to Torah and take what we can do the best way possible.
I couldn't agree with you more.
Dr. Woolf, I thank you, Professor, Rabbi, Doctor, and Jeffrey. I thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure. Be well.
Next time you're in my neck of the woods, please call.
I will. Bye-bye.
Bye.